my name is Allie,
Jake.
and our study is the effects of body weight supported treadmill training and balance training on functional walking ability in chronic TBI, a case study. So a traumatic brain injury is an injury to brain tissue caused by an external force, and that force will cause a cascade of cellular changes which will further spread the damage to other areas of the brain. About 1.1 million Americans will encounter TBI each year, and of those 1.1 million Americans, about 50,000 of those will die. And to date, 3.2 million Americans are living with disabilities related to their TBI, and the most common cause of that TBI are falls. And since this affects our central nervous system, which governs everything we do in our body, some related impairments would be changes in strength, tone, synergy, coordination, posture, balance, and it could also affect our cognition, behavior, and emotion. And from those impairments, we can conclude that possible activity limitations would be ambulation, transfers, communication, activities of daily living, and it would affect our overall functional mobility. So the purpose of this study was to examine the effects of combining body weight supported treadmill training with the balance training on the functional walking ability with a person with a chronic TBI. And balance is important because it is the baseline of everything we do all day, every day. It is a prerequisite for our functional mobility. And it's important in regulating our postural control because it helps us navigate in our environment. So if we encounter an obstacle, our balance will help us get through that obstacle, which is the role in correcting improper movement, which overall helps us be safe.
Going into the benefits of bodyweight supported treadmill training, a study by Bowden found that there are 4 neurological impairments that lead to problems with gait training in patients. It is decreased strength, decreased motor control, decreased cardiovascular demand, and decreased dynamic balance. This bodyweight supported treadmill allows you to work on all 4 of these impairments while decreasing the physical demand on the physical therapist working with the patient. This allows the therapist to provide more verbal and physical cues to decrease gait deviations and facilitate a more normalized gait. This is also a task-specific activity which is integral in motor relearning for any patient with a neurological disorder. Going into our subject for this study, he is a 19-year-old male who suffered a TBI in December of 2011 during a snowboarding accident. This was not a traditional snowboarding accident where he was coming down the mountain and collided with another snowboarder or tree. He was at the base of the mountain and he fell while he was standing up with his helmet on, and then he tried to get back up and he collapsed, where he was then taken to the emergency department with a Glasgow Coma Scale score of 3, which is the lowest score that you can get on the Glasgow Coma Scale, and it basically means that he was unresponsive. Later to treat this patient for his subdermal hematoma, which he also had, he had a craniectomy to decrease the pressure in his head. Later he had cranioplasty to replace the portion of the skull that was removed. Going into his current presentation, he had some synergistic patterns, most evident in his left upper extremity, though he did have synergistic patterns into his bilateral lower extremities as well. Going off that, he did have increased tone, again most evident in his left upper extremity, but also present in his bilateral lower extremities. He had decreased tone in his trunk, which led to strength deficits for his trunk muscles. This altogether led to balance deficits, and his overall most limiting factor for functional mobility seemed to be his ataxia, which was secondary to his impaired coordination. Some of the gait deviations that we found were he had decreased heel strike, decreased toe clearance, he had increased scissoring, he had posterior trunk lean, as well as the occasional hip circumduction. Going into the methods of our sub-case study, these are the outcome measures that we chose to measure the patient with. We started with the 6-minute walk test to measure his endurance. Then we went to the tug to measure his transfers, ambulation, and gait speed. And we moved to the Berg balance scale to measure multiple facets of his balance. And then finally to the modified functional reach test to measure his dynamic balance.
So our case study was broken up into 2 modules. They were both 8 weeks long. We met once a week for 45 to 90 minutes. The first module was focused on balance training, which was more towards 90 minutes long, also once a week. And then there was an 8-week break where he continued to do physical therapy interventions. And then he came back for module 2, which was focused on body weight supported treadmill training, which was approximately 45 minutes long for each session. So each of these modules, the difficulty was progressed when the patient reported 4 out of 10 or less on an RP scale of difficulty, or when less and less compensations were noted. So first, the balance module. The purpose of this module was to build a solid foundation of balance and motor control to be successful in the distracted stepping, which I'll explain in a minute. So to gain that background skill, we developed a balance module that started from seated exercise, progressed into standing exercise. We worked within his base of support and then progressed outside of his base of support. And we were working on static balance, then progressed into dynamic balance. Once we were comfortable with that, we brought him into a standing position to work on weight shifting, and that led us into the distracted stepping exercise. So this was adapted from a study by Leach, and the purpose of this was to focus the attention or shift the attention from the actual task of weight shifting towards an external target, thinking that the actual skill of weight shifting would then be subconscious, which would result in a more smooth weight shift, which was definitely seen in our patient. So we would start this exercise in the parallel bars by asking him to step towards a target, which we would choose either the right or left leg, and then we would progress those steps into further steps, steps crossing midline, steps behind him, which was also great to incorporate a trunk rotation for him to look back to find those targets. And then we would further increase that difficulty by increasing the cognitive demand. So we would list off a series of steps that he would have to complete in order, which he also did fantastic with. The weight shifts were beautiful and controlled, which was an excellent pre-gait activity, which transitioned greatly into the body weight supported treadmill training module. Joel.
So going into the body weight supported treadmill training, this is the apparatus that we use to unweight the patient. It uses an air pressure to lift the patient up through the harness. So going into the progression, we started by trying to obtain 45 minutes total of gait training per session. We did this in 3 intervals, and we tried to get to the subject to obtain 15 minutes total of gait training per interval. However, we would stop the interval if the subject reported a 7 out of 10 on the RPE, where we would take a 3-minute break and stretch his gastro. We then progressed the study by increasing the speed. We used his preferred walking speed, which started at 0.6 miles per hour and then moved to 0.7 miles per hour. We did attempt to go up to 0.8 miles per hour at one point. However, the subject presented with a lot more deviation, so we ended up going back down to 0.7 miles per hour for the duration of the study. We then went towards his upper extremity support. So he started the study with both hands on the treadmill, and then in week 5, we took off his hands, trying to initiate a more normalized gait with arm swing and trunk rotation. However, the patient still liked to hold his hands in midline while his hands were not supported by the treadmill, so we ended up focusing more on the trunk rotation. Finally, we decreased the percentage of his unweighting even further, getting down to 31% unweighted by week 8. Going into the results. So first off, we had the 6-minute walk test. From baseline to post-intervention 1, he did surpass the MDC of 36.6 meters. And then in module 2, from pre-intervention to post-intervention, he did not meet that NDC. However, overall, from baseline to post-intervention 2, he did sustain the improvement above the MDC at 36.6 meters. Going into the tug, from baseline to post-intervention 1, he did surpass the MDC of 2.7 seconds of the MDC, and then in the second module, he did not meet that MDC from pre-intervention to post-intervention. However, again, overall, from baseline to post-intervention 2, he did meet that baseline, that MDC.
During the modified functional reach test, between baseline and post-intervention testing of Module 1, he did surpass the MDC of 3.7 centimeters. And then during Module 2, from pre-intervention to post-intervention, he was just shy of that MDC. However, the overall improvement was greater than baseline. And then for the Berg balance scale, he started with a 7 and then ended with an 8 for Module 1, which was below the 4.4 for the MDC, and he stayed at that 8 mark throughout the rest of the intervention. So to date, this is the first study that analyzed bodyweight supported treadmill training combined with a balance module on the effects of functional walking mobility in a person 6 years post-injury. So our study did see improvements in outcome measures, quality of gait, and motor control. And although in Module 2, the outcome measures did not appear to have improved, the tests that we chose were not sensitive enough to pick up the changes in quality of movement. So overall, his gait deviations decreased, his motor control was much more smooth, and his overall functional mobility just looked a lot cleaner. And it is awesome to see that these improvements were made 6 years post-injury, because typically the optimal window of recovery is between the initial 6 months after injury up to about a year. So it is really encouraging to see that these results and improvements have been made so far out past the initial injury, which shows that PT intervention is beneficial in helping people with this type of chronic issue way past that initial window.
Going into the limitations of this study, it was a case study, so it cannot be generalized towards the population of TBI. And while we were measuring our outcome measures, we did provide manual assistance. So this did de-standardize 2 of the tests, the 6-minute walk and the tug. However, the subject could not perform these safely without the manual assistance. And then to the biggest challenge of the study was definitely the harness. The harness did not always cooperate with us. There was multiple sessions where we had to adjust it multiple times, and then there was other sessions where it worked perfectly, adding more variability to each session. And then finally, the frequency. We planned this out for 1 time per week for 8 weeks, which if you're trying to learn something or relearn something, it is not the optimal frequency. You definitely want to be practicing it more than once per week. Finally, going into our conclusion, although this is a case study, it cannot be generalized. The results cannot be generalized. The results show a potential benefit for other people with this diagnosis, as well as potential functional return well past the optimal window for recovery. Questions?